Welcome to Mr. Marr's 3-Minute History, quick summaries about a range of different history topics. Today we're going back to the event which brought the Cold War to an end, which was the collapse of the USSR, or Soviet Union as it was sometimes known. It's important to understand some background about this. For almost half a century after World War II ended, there was a major divide in the world. On the one hand, we had the Western side, led by the United States, that believed in capitalism. On the other hand, we had the Soviet Union and some other countries that were involved in the belief in communism. This confrontation often turned deadly. At various periods, including the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s and other events such as the Afghanistan War and Vietnam War, both sides became involved in conflict and ultimately huge numbers of people would die. Even the brief hope of the 1970s of détente, when each side seemed to get on a bit better and move away from the threat of war, ultimately never went away. When the 1980s came around, both sides were back to be divided as ever before, and the threat of war seemed ever more likely. However, this hid the fact that the Soviet Union in the 1980s faced a number of pressures which would ultimately play a role in ending them. One key thing was economic problems. Whilst America in the 1980s enjoyed a boom which allowed significant extra spending, this was not the case in the Soviet Union, where they were struggling to pay for basic things. Much of the state-run industries which required huge subsidies were really making no money, and ultimately this was a cost that they could not hope to continue. This also had a knock-on effect on their military, where they couldn't afford to continue the huge levels of spending that they had been, even as America was in fact upping their military spending. At this period, the Soviets had been involved in the Afghanistan War, and rather like America had struggled in Vietnam, so would the Soviet Union. A new Soviet leader in the mid-1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev, had introduced a number of reforms that had significantly changed the Soviet Union. This included glasnost, which was less secrets, and perestroika, which meant more private money being allowed in the economy. Just as there was growing pressure for change within the Soviet Union, though, there was also protests across Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union controlled much of Eastern Europe in an area that was known as the Eastern Bloc, but this was greatly resented by many of the people there who wanted their independence. This was perhaps best exemplified in Poland, where the rise of the political group Solidarity and also the role that Pope John Paul II played in promoting protests undermined the Soviet Union's control. Towards the end of the 1980s, there was a range of revolutions across Eastern Europe. Some of these, such as in Czechoslovakia, were peaceful, and others, like in Romania, were violent. The most famous one was, of course, the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, which ultimately led to the unification of Germany. As these changes were happening all across Eastern Europe, so they spread to the Soviet Union. Ultimately, its foundations had been undermined not only by the Eastern Bloc protests, but also the actions of Mikhail Gorbachev and the humiliation of defeat in the Afghanistan War. The election of Boris Yeltsin as Russian president, Yeltsin wanting independence for Russia itself, was a further nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union. In 1991, there was a range of political protests in the Soviet Union, and August saw Mikhail Gorbachev being temporarily removed from power in a coup. This was clear evidence that the Soviet Union was now finished, especially as other parts of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, moved towards their independence. Christmas 1991 would be the last time that the Soviet Union flag would fly.